morning. Welcome to the local summit. Maybe a little gray outside this morning, but inside it's going to be very cheery. We're going to have a very cheery program. Today, instead of our usual timely topics of local interest, we're going to step back and look into the past. Last year, we looked into the history of the village of Mamaroneck, and today we're going to have a look at the history of the town of Mamaroneck. I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Megan, and he will give you the program of the day.
Thank you. My name is Jeff Megan, or on one Tuesday a month, Mr. Tidbit. And then I got onto the board and I made the mistake of volunteering an idea. And I said, you know, a lot of times you have a warm-up person. You know, Johnny Carson had Ed McMahon, and he came out and warmed up the crowd. Letterman did it by himself. So I said, why don't you do a little 5-minute business and warm up the crowd and give a little bit of history, oral history, because I'm a great believer that although there are many families that have been here for generations, that we do live in a somewhat transitional community. And some people don't realize that things like there used to be a miniature golf where McDonald's is. I mean, these are important facts of life. And so of course, since I volunteered the idea, I got volunteered for the job, and hence my little tidbit. And I give a quiz about every 3 months. You know, I have to tell some people to be quiet because they know all the answers. We had Norm Rosenblum and Joe Germano, two fellows who grew up in the community. And by the way, as an aside, Emmy Lou, let's see if I got this right, Emmy Lou and Joe Germano and Jack Coughlin were all classmates. I mean, come on, we got some history here. Oh, there we go. The lady answered the question. 1943 Mamaroneck. So with that, we did one on the village of Mamaroneck. Now we're doing one on the town of Mamaroneck. And I have really 3 terrific people on my panel here. First of all, the lady that knows more about our 3 communities than probably anybody ever, Valerie O'Keefe. And when I turn, unfortunately, guys, we only have one working mic. So I'm here as the oil and the mic carrier back and forth. And I'm going to ask each one of them to just say a few words about where they grew up and what little area and so on. Anyhow, the next person is Jack Coughlin. You heard of Coughlin Insurance down on Myrtle Boulevard there. Jack has been involved in every aspect of our community, Boy Scouts, etc. Knows almost as much as Valerie, but we'll have a contest. More? Okay. And then we have, I had to go out and get somebody young. So I went out and I got Jim Whittemore. And Jim Whittemore has been involved in a little bit of real estate. But probably the most important job he had was being a bartender at the Bevan. A lot of stories and a lot of history came out of the Bevan. Anyhow, Jim has been involved in real estate. His father was involved in real estate. Sutton and Whittemore on the corner of Beach Avenue and the Post Road. Old Thomas B. Sutton. We can talk about some of the old real estate guys here, Mandy and etc. So I'm going to turn it over to Valerie first, and for a quick couple of minutes, and go down the line.
Can each one stand?
Yeah, we'll stand if physically able. Well, I know that Jim Whittemore, I think, lived by the brook, because he used to walk by my house as a child. But I moved here with my parents from the city in 1950 at a house on the corner of Orchard Road and Weaver Street, the red one, the one on the side toward the Post Road, not the side toward Murray Avenue School. And I went to Murray Avenue School. And in those days, people there were more dress codes. Not that they had us dressed up like a private school, but you had to have I think we mostly had dresses. Sometimes we might have had a skirt and blouse. The boys had, they didn't have polo shirts. They had like shirts with collars. Usually they had, they were plaid looking things. And I think they did wear blue jeans. I think that was allowed. Sneakers were allowed. And I walked to school and there were no crossing guards, but there was a motorcycle cop at the corner of Forest Avenue and Weaver Street. We called him by his first name, which is probably kind of informal. His name was Johnny, and he had the motorcycle, and it was, scared the people to slow down because he pushed it up a bit. And we all went in. Now, when I got there, boys and girls walked in the same door of the school. However, there were entrances, boys' entrance and girls' entrance, which I think have been gotten rid of it after World War II, probably. Murray Avenue School was built in 1923 or something like that, and the original part of it is the part that's the closest to Forest Avenue. Then in 1930-something, the second part was built, which is the part closer to the village of Larchmont. The woman who ran the place was called Miss Hirschbeck, and she was about 6 feet tall. And she was a maiden lady who lived with her mother, who was 6'2", in Portchester. And we were all kind of scared of Miss Hirschbeck. The teachers were all smart, and they were all very well educated. I was thinking of this the other day. They probably couldn't have gotten any kind of jobs in the professions, because at that point, even though my mother was a lawyer and she got out of law school in 1937, these people probably would have gotten out of teachers' colleges, the ones that I had before that. Like, they had normal schools, which were 3-year things. First they were 2 years, then they were 3 years, then they turned into state teachers' colleges. But a lot of them went to places like Bates, and they went to New England schools or Seven Sisters schools. Some of them came from Pennsylvania. They were highly literate, and one of the things they used to do is if you had extra time, they'd read to you. I mean, even in 5th grade, Mrs. Bard used to read Kipling to us. So she read E.B. White, and then we would write letters to E.B. White in Maine, and he would write back, "Dear 5th grade of Mrs. Bard." And we'd all sign letters, and he'd mention things that we'd mentioned, how we liked Stuart Little or whoever it was. And there were literary things. When we learned about the Jungle Book, she taught us about India and how it was a colony of Great Britain. See, it was after 1945, but who knew the difference, So, or whenever they got loose from England. The kids almost virtually all walked. Most people had one automobile, so if the father got taken to the train in the car, or he walked there, and then the mother, almost everybody's mother was home, would be in the house with the car. But I'd say 95% of the kids in 1950 walked home at lunchtime. So you walked there in the morning, you walked back for lunch, you ate lunch, you then walked back to the school, then you walked back home. And when you think of the number of calories that was burning on kids that are now being driven places, it's a lot of calories when you keep adding it up, adding it up, adding it up. We had Girl Scouts were brownies, and something that was even cooler than brownies for girls were called bluebirds. The bluebirds were the junior campfire girls. And in Murray Avenue School, it was more nerdy to be a brownie than it was to be a bluebird. The trouble with being a bluebird is they gave you a felt vest, and instead of getting, like, the brownies got little badges that they would put on things. The bluebirds had to sew these things pretending they were like Indians. Beads and things. Unless you had, your mother was a seamstress, your vest might have looked pretty bad. But that was the hip thing to be. And then we had, what do you call those little blue people? Cub Scouts. Everybody who was a boy wanted to be a Cub Scout, everybody, and they had troops and den mothers and den fathers. And once a month at the Murray Avenue Auditorium, they had meetings of the Cub Scouts and pack meetings. And virtually every boy in the school over 3rd grade was there. And if you weren't one of these people, you were like out of it. Really, it was like bad. They didn't have junior Boy Scouts. You know, I mean, I guess they were the junior Boy Scouts. And they brought them to Flint Park. They had activities all the time. And the poor mothers would be stuck as den mothers with these kids once a week where they'd come to your house and run around in the earth. I remember my mother, she was almost tied up by these people. They had activities. Now the Girl Scouts had a Girl Scout house, which still exists, down Harmon Drive. And at that point, there was no New York State Thruway. So you were on Weaver Street and you go straight to Mamaroneck, which turned into Waverly Avenue. The Girl Scout house was really pretty nice, and they had all kinds of activities, and girls were and they'd make them sleep overnight there pretending they were in the woods. Because if they took them to Camp Rock Hill, which was in Carmel or Mahopac or someplace, Putnam County, they'd have to practice, you know, in the Girl Scout house. So I never went there. My sister and my best friend went there, and they both cut their hands on cans. You know, you had to pretend you were an Indian or something. So that was the extracurricular activities. Now, as far as the boys went, as soon as it got warm, they would have softball. It was softball, beginning in like 4th grade, every night, beginning in, let's say, late April, all the way through June, in the playground. And the gym teacher, Mr. Smith, would pitch the ball because otherwise it would go on too long. And virtually every boy did that. And then girls, which I always found this annoying, didn't go. I don't believe in cheerleaders by sexual orientation or whatever it is. You know, I mean, the girls would be going, yes, yes, and the boys would be hitting. But that died out, you know, because the girls then got a league later on. So that was the school. Junior high we all went to. That's when we started to mix. When Chatsworth, Murray, Central School, which is what is now the town hall, which had been the original high school for Mamaroneck, and Mamaroneck Avenue School. We all went to junior high, which was the building on the Post Road, that big thing that's now called the high school. And that was intimidating because it was a gigantic building, 3 stories high, and all of a sudden you weren't in your own neighborhood. It was just kind of intimidating. It was much more urban in the sense that people were running up and down stairs. It wasn't so relaxed. So those are the school things. The other thing that I just thought, telling Jack that that's enough. Let these guys say what they want to say.
Well, we'll come back to you too.
Good morning. Good morning. Well, listening to Valerie reminds me of a lot of things. But first I have to acknowledge Emmy Lou, because Emmy Lou and I first met in 7th grade, which was 1937, and over here at the junior high school, and we've known each other ever since. And somebody mentioned Joe Germano, and Joe was the 3rd one in the triumph. 3 of us, they grew up in town, stayed in town, built businesses, and were successful enough to still stay here with the taxes we pay, with our own income fixed. But anyway, I just like to tell you a brief history of my involvement. I moved here in 1935 as a 10-year-old, and we rented a house on Rocking Stone Avenue. The best memory I have is that in back of the house is Highwood Avenue in New Rochelle. We were on the property line. There was a family there that had a good-looking woman, and she drew the attraction of an actor, Jimmy Stewart. Now, when you're 10 years old, you don't remember or know anything about who Jimmy Stewart is, but you do know that he's somebody prominent. And I can remember once standing at the back fence with a bunch of kids yelling, "Jimmy, Jimmy!" And he actually came out on the patio and waved to us and said, "Sorry, kids, but I'm busy. I don't want to come talk to you." I got even with him, though. In 1953, I was at the National Jamboree, the Boy Scouts of America, and I was one of the junior leaders, and I looked at the program for the next day, and it said, "Jimmy Stewart is visiting." We wrote a note, brought it over to the VIP headquarters, and handed it to him. The next day, a car pulled up to our unit, and someplace Diane, my wife who was sitting here, there's a picture at home of Jimmy Stewart and I sitting in front of our tent, and we had a great visit. A little bit about changes. All of you know where Edgewood and Murray Avenue is. I don't know whether you remember, but there used to be lights there. And there was a stoplight on a post. You know, it was knocked down 3 times, and every time it was knocked down, they put up stop signs, and they had less accidents than they did when they had the stoplight. So that's why we no longer have the stoplight on there. World War II really changed our lives and changed the community. A lot of you don't know that the building next to mine on Myrtle Boulevard, known as the Clock Tower around the corner, in 1940, when the draft started, they had so many troops at Fort Slocum that they had to put them someplace. So they staged them in there for a couple of months. And we used to ride down the street on our bicycles. And what do you think they'd do? They'd march up and down what was then Myrtle Boulevard and do calisthenics. And there wasn't much else they could do with them. But you always knew at 5 o'clock where they were going. They were all at the railroad station going to New Rochelle to see a movie and then come back. Larchmont never was a great town for troops. They didn't have the right number of bars. One of my proudest moments of being involved is that when I was in the service, my dad, who was active in the American Legion, sent me a membership card. He signed me up to the American Legion. I still pay that renewal every year. Well, now I'm a lifetime member, but I felt out of respect to my dad, I should continue it. But when I was discharged, I was in my early 20s, and they appointed a committee to select a war memorial. And my dad had me appointed to that committee as the youngest member. We had a meeting at the Larchmont Hall, and they were going to put the memorial on the Constitutional Park, which is opposite St. John and Paul. Now that was very good for the village of Larchmont. St. Augustine, sorry.
One Catholic church and another.
Anyway, I objected to it going there. I felt the town of Mamaroneck should be respected, and I wanted the memorial where it is now on Myrtle Boulevard. I made a plea, and I finally sold them when I said, "Well, I don't know why you say that." I said, "The town supports the library, and we're a part of Larchmont in that way, and I think more people would go by it there." And so that's why the War Memorial is there, where it is on Murray and Chatsworth. Myrtle Boulevard changed dramatically with the thruway. We used to have stores. There was the Plaza Pharmacies, there was Christides, before you went over the bridge. Christides, and if you remember Ray Paola, who used to be a town councilman, he had an electronics TV store. Well, it was a radio repair shop then, and then he started selling TVs. And there used to be 3 or 4 big houses with a lot of people living in them. And a couple of them Italian named Tortorellas, okay. Well, most of them burned down over a period of time. A couple other things that I remember is the police booth. There used to be a booth right there in the center. And the policemen knew everybody in the town, and we as kids knew them all. I I became involved in the Boy Scouts because right behind the Murray Avenue School was the Scout House. It was on the triangle of David Avenue. It was Troop 2. I went to a scout meeting trying to join Troop 2, but I was told there was a 6-month waiting period because they only had room for so many boys in that small cabin. They had about 40 and you couldn't join. Troops were big in those days. So I went home and I told my dad I couldn't join the Boy Scouts. Well, the next day he said, we're going over to the Weaver Street Firehouse. There's a troop there. And I kind of felt that I had really had to show them that I wanted to be a scout. And it's the best thing I ever did in my life because I've got 80 years of scouting. I served not only at the local council board, the regional, but I'm on the national board. And I've had some wonderful experiences. I'm going to have another one this Friday when I meet with Cardinal Bob Gates and a couple other distinguished scouters when they present the highest award to the Cardinals at his residence on Friday. So it's had some great thrills and great opportunities. And I would just leave with one other thing. I came back and I joined the Lions Club. And one of the reasons why I like the Lions Club is when we left to go into the Army, we used to gather, everybody that was leaving on certain days would gather at the Weaver Street Firehouse, and the town supervisor or some of the officials would come out, make a little speech telling us how great we were to go, and then the Lions Club president would hand everybody a sewing kit. I never used it much, but I managed to carry it for 3 years in Europe and all over the places that I went, and brought it home and always thought the Lions were pretty good to give us something like that. So I accepted their invitation. I see my friend Paul here, and we've had a lot of fun there. It's been a great community to grow up in. And Jeff, what do you say?
Good memories. Good memories. Also, I happen to know Henry Lou Sleeper as well. I was his partner with her in real estate for 15 years, and it's good to see you. Jeff Megan has asked me to come here. I met Jeff in the early 70s, and we've done a lot of business together also. And so he's asked me, since I moved from the Alden house, when we had our third child in the family, I was the third, moved to 98 East Brookside Drive in the Gardens. And the Gardens, which you may remember, was developed by a fellow named Clifford Harmon, who obviously named the street after the short and the long version of Harmon Drive. It was 140 acres, and back then the kids said, we live on the brook. Well, and I was told when I got older it was really the Sheldrake River, which also was, I guess the Europeans, when they first got here, they said, that duck over there looks like a European duck, and it's called the Sheldrake, and it's stuck. Now, I'm not quite sure exactly where they were, since the Sheldrake starts in White Plains and goes through Scarsdale and down here. But it was a great place to grow up. We used to shovel the snow on the lake, on the river for the neighborhood. The Watermore boys would take care of that for free. We wouldn't charge. Today they would. We'd go on down, and the most famous place in growing up in town was the Duck Pond, which is a man-made lake. And we used to have in the middle of it, as you know, there's a little island out there. Not only would you have 300 and some odd people ice skating around that lake, you'd have a bonfire in the middle, which was terrific. And you'd be selling, you know, people would have hot chocolate and stuff like that. Courier and Ives, it looked terrific. But then along came, in 1958, the Newland Thruway. And with the salt and the rumbling of the trucks, I don't think it's ever really been the same. Do they skate there anymore? When it's cold enough. But normally, every year you would. And what sits on top of the falls, it used to be a cotton mill, you know, hundreds of years ago, the Mott family. And then it was changed to a stone clubhouse for the garden area. And They had a tennis court down below and things of that nature. Now it's 110 East Hickory Grove Drive, and it's just a residential home. But when the thruway came, I always remember while it was being built, taking the bike across there to Revere Road to visit friends, what have you. But I do remember I went to school at St. John Paul. I'll tell you about that in a minute. There was I went to school with Carol Santora, and her mother and father lived on the short end of Harmon Drive. And at that point, they were saying to all those on Harmon Drive, we're going to have to relocate your home somewhere. Not Mrs. Santoro. We would go down as kids, look at Mrs. Santoro sitting on her porch, and if you could visualize if the woman owned a rifle, she would have brought it out, and she would sit there with a broom, and she was never going to leave. I believe the story goes is that those homes were saved on that side because when they were building the thruway, they realized that they had to make the stretch go straighter instead of curving around towards Harmon, because they realized that these trucks are going to be going 65 miles an hour and not 35. So they had to straighten it out, and therefore, for the grace of God, Mrs. Santoro, who is still there, no, she's not. She was a happy camper. So thank God that happened. The thruway, and actually, I was reading where in the 50s, because of the threat of nuclear war, Cold War, trucks had more transportation getting things out to the suburbs. That's really why, or what gave them the thought about having the thruway built, whatever. And then backing up, and we're just talking about the garden section where I grew up. St. John Paul was built in 1952, and my only claim to fame there was I was the first one to enter kindergarten all the way through 8th grade, and my brother was in 1st grade. And the only drawback of the school, it had no real playground or no sports. But the other thing was there were 56 children in each class. And someone said, every time I showed a picture, there was always 54. I said, look, when you have 56 in the class, there's always 4 home sick, without a doubt. So it was back then that they, I believe also was the first and only house of worship that is in the town of Mamaroneck. Still is. I think then there was an influx of Catholics or whatever because there was like 500 students, and I guess they figured if it overran into Murray, you'd have hell on wheels as far as the amount of people there. Does anybody remember also in the gardens they had a 10-acre tennis and swim club? The Orchid Farm, well, was that, I know there was 10 acres, and in the 20s it was a tennis and swim club, and then it was called Badger Day. In 1946 they had Jack and Ruth Collins who bought it, and they had this big swimming pool, 50 by whatever, and they had 3 Olympian swimmers that came out of there. What they also had is the kids in the neighborhood, just after dark, there were other Olympian swimmers in that pool. And also when the Collins woke up, they didn't realize there could be that many acorns in the pool at the same time. So that's when I got to know Johnny the policeman. Johnny Caputo. As a matter of fact, one time going to church, I do remember he would be directing traffic, and he got on his motorcycle, and he wanted to do a wheelie. Unfortunately, the motorcycle fell on the ground and weighed so much he couldn't get it up, and he blocked traffic for up and down Weaver Street. So all the kids were naturally laughing at him and things of that nature. Just one little historical thing. At the turn of the century, across from John and Paul, there was no fire department whatsoever. They only had the villages. And what happened is that if you were living in the town of Mamaroneck and you had your home on fire, the law was you had to get permission of the mayor in order to get the trucks to cross the line. Well, if your house is burning and the mayor's taking a dip down at the Long Island Sound, you're out of luck. And so they changed it, and in 1906 they built one. And then in 1926 they built a new firehouse. And that's when they moved the police station. I don't know if you remember. It sits on 11 Edgewood Avenue. And then in '86, they moved over to the town. So there was a lot of things going on there. They even had a jail cell back there. 2 cells, right, back in there. It went all the way down to Merle Boulevard, whatever. So I took some notes about these places. There was one part of the, when I was growing up, I had a lot of friends who lived in Elkin Park. And I think that you're all familiar with Elkin Park. After World War II, the returning
Jack
vets.
Coughlin lived there.
Did you
How
live
many
there?
years did you live there?
12 years.
Wow.
12 years. And how many children did you have when you...
5.
5, in one of those little houses.
Well, these vets came back. They were going to call it originally Foxhole Estates. And they got together. Well, they had 44 guys get together, and they got $42,000 up. And they gave it to Bano and Madeline Elkin. And they said, here, 5.5 acres. They looked around for land, couldn't find any, found this spot. I guess the Elkins felt a little bit like, I should do something for the returning vets. So they gave them the money back. But they said, you're not going to call it that anymore. We're going to call it Elkin Park. So they did. There's a plaque there now, I believe, with 2 benches. And there's a big statement about how the community came together. There was a fellow named O'Reilly who was an architect in the village, and he gave free advice and free pro bono work as far as designing. What do you have? 12 buildings, 50 units, 1 to 2 bedrooms, and things of that nature. It was the first cluster housing that started in Westchester. That type. Oh. Yeah, it was good. So that's what that started, and that, like I said, there is Foxhall Estates was interesting, returning vets of that nature. Anybody remember also one other? When I had a paper route, I used to go up Rocking Stone Avenue. You see the big rock that's sitting up there right now? Well, the history is supposedly back then it did lean a little left and right, and you could actually sit up there and all that nonsense. This was a glacier rock that was brought down 8 zillion years ago. And then in the 20s, they had a great idea that we're going to put sewers in, pave the road, and use dynamite. They did, and the rock went, and we thought it was the end of rock and roll, but it was not, obviously. And now it sits in place, and that's the history. The highest point in town, I don't know why it's called Hannah's Heights or something of that nature back then, but that's what it was. Brook and Glen is actually the highest, I think, part of it. So that's a few things as far as some famous people in the area. I know, Jack, you mentioned Jimmy Stewart up on Ridge Road. Long ago, there was a young girl, probably in her teens, that was asked to do a one-act play for a fellow that had a big house up there that could put 250 in his living room. He was, it was a theatrical group called the Mummers. I don't know if anybody knows that, but, and her name was Claire Wemlinger, and she came and did the one act. And, in the future, she was called my father's first cousin, Claire Trevor, who was in the first Stagecoach with John Wayne, Key Largo with Bogey, and the High of the Mighty. That was Claire. Also, on Valley Stream Road around the corner from me, this is, everybody would like to know this, remember Mighty Mouse?
Yeah.
Well, my cousin Tom Morrison was the voice of Mighty Mouse, and I had to hear him coming in the back door all the time, He goes, hi kids, and all that other stuff. Clarabelle was supposedly lived on Danny Street. Dante, I still call it Dante from the 50s, but it was changed, I guess. And who else? We had Billy Van Heusen, was our only football player. He was the class of '64, a year ahead of me, and he went on to the Denver Broncos for 12 years. Yeah, he was. It was almost boring watching him run 80 yards for a touchdown. I mean, he was that good. We had Eddie Foy and the little ones lived on the New Rochelle line up here for a little while. Let's see who else is famous. Emmy Lou Sleeper on Bayard Avenue. We worked with that. And let me see what else I had written down. A few things. I will get back later with some thoughts. Just a great place to grow up. I think that the The garden section is one of my favorite. Selling real estate for over 40 years, I know all the sections. I still like the garden section the best. I think it's the most beautiful. And if we can just get the trucks to stop rumbling, we can get back on the ice.
We learn from each other's comments. The house that we live in on Byron Lane, I heard purchased from the man I introduced to the builder years before he built the house. His name was Mansell McLean. He had a niece by the name of Beattie, but you all remember her as Shirley McLean. And I can remember my younger sister going over. She was the same age as McLean's daughter, and she'd come home and say, "Oh, we had such a good time, and we talked, and we played with Shirley." So that's just another famous name, and we're still in that house. And once the doorbell rang about 7 o'clock at night, people from Boston, they introduced themselves as relatives of the McLeans, and they wondered if the house was still the same. So we showed them around, had a cup of coffee, and listened to stories about Shirley and her uncle living in that house where we are now.
Also on Byron Lane, there was the guy, Danae, was his name?
Danae.
Danae. And
Richard Janae was in my class.
But no, but he was a famous mystery writer. What was it? What?
Ellery Queen.
Ellery Queen. Now, also, you know, we used to go on class trips from Murray to the Rabe's Orchid Farm. Somebody Rabe went to Murray. And all the streets, which are now McKenna Place and the thing next to it, I don't know, what's that, off Rockland Avenue and along Baldwin there, that was a gigantic big farm, and there were hothouses and there were orchids, which they sent all over the world. But speaking about celebrities and the garden section, there was a kid in school with us called Joel Brasiler, and his father was a publisher in a big publishing house, Brazil something. It was in, I don't know whether it was part of Random House or whatever it was, but he was Arthur Miller's publisher. And we found out that Marilyn Monroe was in the house. And so we all got on our bikes. Now, I'm older than Mr. Whittemore, but everybody had a bike, and we rushed over there, and kids were getting up in trees and things. It's the house where Nedra Gillette lived. You know that house?
Yeah, the one that was torn down.
The one that was torn down. Yeah, the brook went through it. But kids said they saw Marilyn Monroe in there. I might have thought that I did. But I never did see Marilyn Monroe. The other thing about the Thruway was, we used to get on our bikes and ride all the way to Rye or Greenwich on the Thruway before it opened. Where you could ride all the way to, to the Bronx before the thing opened.
Drag racing.
Yeah, well, we were on bikes. But the Thruway, now where Myrtle Boulevard is now, if you looked across the street from where that fingernail place is, or back up to Washington Square, backed up on what would be the railroad tracks were about, as Jack said, 4 big houses. Well, what happened was that they moved them on big trucks to Myrtle Boulevard. And there was a garage there, and on top of the garage, I'm trying to think of the name of it, Guadanola, they took the top of the house off and they put it on wheels and they dragged it down Myrtle Boulevard. And it's kind of like at the foot of Preston Street. So that was an exciting thing. The other thing that I thought, since Memorial Day is coming up, which we then called, some of us, Decoration Day. Then it became Memorial Day. It was different all over the United States because whatever day it was the 31st of May, that was it, the kids were out of school, the soldiers were marching, and everybody got their bike, because everyone had a bike, and got crepe paper, which they would buy at Felderman's or the corner store, which was red, white, and blue, and you'd put it in the spokes of the wheels and wrap them all over. The whole town and village would be together as one, but now, since it's one of those 3-day weekends, it's almost an afterthought. And in the village of Larchmont, they moved it to Thursday night, no matter what, because one of the former public officials wanted to go away to a summer house. So it's lost whatever it had, other than for Bert Corwin and the VFW, who keeps things, memories. The other one thing I'd say is about the movies. The movies cost 25 cents. The candy was 5 cents. And the manager in my day was called Pinhead. You remember him? He was a bald guy. Now, I don't know who put the moniker on this guy, but Pinhead. It was very genteel in Larchmont. It wasn't like where you were in the city where they had those matrons with the flashlights that would keep the kids under control. You didn't have to control the Larchmont kids. They were pretty. The only thing is it had a very weird bathroom, which it still did. You had that creepy stairs, you go down there, but there was a murder down there once, you know. But the kids would ride the bikes or walk. You could put the bike in front of the movies, go in there, and come out, and the bike was there. They didn't lock anything. The same thing is I remember once secretly going down Harmon Drive and going to Mamaroneck by myself, because Blackboard Jungle was playing there, and it was during the summer, and my parents probably wouldn't have told me to go to Blackboard Jungle. But everyone had the book Blackboard Jungle, and they'd say, go to page 47, go to page 32, or whatever it was. And it was the same thing. When you went through Mamaroneck, it was an industrial area, and they had the Frito factory. They made Fritos. You could smell that corn and that oil all along Waverly Avenue. But you parked your bike in front of the Mamaroneck movie theater and would come out and nobody took it. And the Mamaroneck movie theater was much fancier. They had a balcony and, you know, all that. But we had fun in those days. I think that the Thruway changed everything to a certain extent. There were 3 Gristedes in Larchmont, 1 in the town, 2 in the village, 1 over by where Manor Deli is, another one where that place that just shut down, you know, next to the cleaners, on Chatsworth Avenue, there was one there. Then there was one on the bridge going from the village where like Nikki's is over to the town, and on that bridge was Blind Joe's. Blind Joe's was a shack. It was made out of wood, and Joe was in there, and kids would go from the town to the movies or into, quote, the village. They never called it going into town. That's a new expression, like only 40 years old. But Blind Joe sold penny candy and like jawbreakers. So for like 2 or 3 cents, you could get some of this repulsive candy that was on pieces of paper and put it through your teeth and go to the movies with a little package of stuff. When the Thruway came, Blind Joe's got knocked down, and they built him a little place over on the other side of the tracks, which is now basically where that town of Mamaroneck police booth is. But he never got any business over there for Blind Joe. And that, of course, was common in those days. Emmy Lou.
I just wanted to tell you, this is truly a rural town. When Stonecrest was built, the apartments...
Can you hear her? When Stonecrest was built, that's 21 North Chatsworth.
I just called loud.
Not loud enough.
There were only 3 big apartments in Larchmont then. There were Stonecrest, the Hills, and Chatsworth Gardens. But in back of Stonecrest was a farm that raised goats. And if you want to think traffic problems, wait till you have the goats on the loose on Chatsworth Avenue.
Now, I remember the goat woman. She had like osteoporosis. And it was a hill. We're like 35 north. We're Go Hill. Where 17 North Chatsworth, as Emmy Lou said, was there. And then going down Myrtle Boulevard was a big hill, and it went all the way up to where Washington Square would be. And she was very old, and she had a black dress, and she had a stick. And she chased the goats back and forth, and she had like a little lean-to for the goats. Somebody told me recently that she sold the goat milk, I don't know if this is apocryphal or, I don't know, maybe true, to Nourishell Hospital, the goat milk for mothers who couldn't nurse babies, and they didn't really have formula or anything, but goat milk could be digested by babies. But she was part of the group of Italian immigrants who came to the town of Mamaroneck and lived up North Chatsworth by where Edgewood goes across. There was a stream there someplace, and they had little houses. Now, if you talk to the Tortorellas and to the other old-time town of Mamaroneck immigrants, not village of Mamaroneck, and they were separate too from the village of Larchmont. Many of them were in the Weaver Street Firehouse, they can tell you, and there are pictures in the archives of wooden houses where people, there was no heat in those things. They had to have coal or wood in the winter to keep them warm. But those people eventually did well and moved down to Myrtle Boulevard, both across by where the thruway is now, where our parking deck is, and also on Myrtle Boulevard.
Oh, she's like a supervisor and a retired mayor. How do I choose? Well, it's a town here.
Thank you all so much for talking about the town of Mamaroneck. And I had the privilege of serving as an elected official with Valerie for a long time, so I got to hear about 12 years worth of history of the town of Mamaroneck, and it was fabulous. So I'm so glad you got to mention the goat lady. But I wanted to just ask all of you, if you remember, what was the feeling about the thruway coming in? Did everyone just accept it, or did any, other than Mr. Sen? Yeah, was there any fight about it? Was there any effort to, preserve or protect the community? Or was it looked at as something good?
I was
Wait a
associated.
minute, before you speak, Jack, I can tell you from growing up in Larchmont, if you ever drove on the Post Road in Larchmont with all of the trucks and what went on, and this was a way to free up US 1 so that we could go back and forth to schools and so on. But as a kid, that road was absolutely treacherous.
The story I heard, and I was associated with the supervisor for a while in business, is that he did not want an exit there in Larchmont going this way. Owen Mandeville.
There you go.
And he used his influence in the state to put the thruway. It went through the Larchmont Railroad Station. We had a nice station that was torn down there. And the original design was for it to go behind Chatsworth Gardens. And if you notice Murray Avenue, there's a bridge. If you go into the park, you can see under Murray Avenue. It's a bridge there, and that was the original idea, to have it like a through, like they had on the Hutch. This is before they thought about putting trucks on the thruway. And that's the reason that they took and straightened out the highway through Larchmont. And the reason we don't have an exit coming from Connecticut is because he didn't want to disturb his residents in Chatsworth Gardens.
It was considered a great relief. 24 hours a day there was traffic on the Post Road. And to go from here to, let's say, Playland could have taken you 25 minutes. But those big 16-wheel trucks, this was the only way to get from New York to Boston. This was it. So it was a relief. Oh, thank God those horrible trucks with the smell and the noise and the thing are gone. So that, there wasn't really, but my father's friend was Charlie Woolsey. Charlie Woolsey was the general counsel of the New York State Thruway Authority. And he used to come by our house when they were building this place and talk about how they were going to not put two exits, or entrance and exits here, because there'd be too much people driving around here and we didn't want them here. I mean, he didn't care, he was in Albany, but the pressure was from Mandeville and somebody else, I suppose. It was political, not to have, you'd have too much traffic coming in and out of Larchmont, which you didn't want, because you were getting the relief of opening up the Post Road. And when the Post Road opened up, it was like nirvana. Those trucks were gone. Yeah.
I just want to validate, go back to that Marilyn Monroe story for a moment. I do remember the house was on Lansdowne, right on the water in the brook. It was a big white house. This is my recollection, because I knew the Brazil family. So we would take turns the Valley Stream Stinkers, that's what we were called. And we would sit on these two horse rocks in front and relay in case we saw her. I didn't have the night shift back then, but that was true. We never saw her, but
People said they
They-
saw
they-
her hair.
they said she was in town.
Blonde.
It might have been the era where she first came out in Playboy, I'm not quite sure, but it aroused a lot of interest in the neighborhood. The other thing that you mentioned also, that there was a stream when you're coming up Chatsworth Avenue from the train. You ever notice on the corner of Lookout and Chatsworth, there's a well that sits there. There used to be a stream that went, and they paved it over, but I don't know how it got the name, maybe in the 60s. It was called the Wishing Well. And today with all texting and this and that, if you wanted to meet your girlfriend somewhere, it would always be at the Wishing Well. I know Henry Howard has his initials still carved in there with Betsy Mills. In case anybody knows them, I mentioned their name anyway. But that's where it is. And right in that section, as Valerie mentioned, right in that section at the turn of the century was a guy named DeSicchio, and he was a developer and builder rather, and he would do all the streets, and he did Beachmont Lake, and he would have his immigrants from Italy come, and they would live there, but they lived in these deplorable little wooden buildings with tar paper on it. They also were extras in D.W. Griffith's movies as well, but they paid him 75 cents a day. I guess that the streets are paved with gold, I guess, and here they are. It was called Shantytown, is what it was. This was Edgewood, Lookout Circle, right in that area there, right over to Murray Avenue. And it was deplorable, it was condemned after a while, and then Larchmont Hills Development Corporation came in and they did all this. But it was,
What was the famous builder in Luke and Glen?
Moody. One thing about Moody, though, there's very few records. I remember in selling real estate, everybody said, "There's an English tutor up there, it's Moodyville, Moody built." And I'm like, whoa, get verification on this baby, because Moody did a lot of things up there. He was called, before the crash, all those tutors were called stockbroker tutors, is what they were. And if you notice Althea Lane, which is a little bit of the Bonnie Briar, well, that was Moody's wife. Althea. Came to Althea. How in God's name do I remember that? I don't.
The name Rook and Glen, does anybody know where it came from? It's really pedestrian. Moody was on vacation in Scotland with his wife on a train and passed a little station called Rook and Glen. And that's how it became Rookin. Wait a minute, the mayor had the ex-mayor.
Mayor Emerita.
Emerita.
My town supervisor is so wise that she asked the same question. So I'll kind of hand it over.
I have a,
Just ask.
I don't know if I'll reach that far.
You can repeat.
I'll repeat it.
Repeat the question.
But compared to the three of you, I feel like a newbie. I only lived in Larchmont 23 years.
Yeah, you are, newbie.
But soon after moving to Larchmont, one of the great discoveries I made was the leather stocking trail, which I've been running.
That was on my list here.
I beat you to it. And all the years I've been running and walking on the leather stocking trail, I've been wondering what was the origin of this wooded corridor that remains. It's such a treasure to have. One, how did it come to be, and where did the name come from?
Well, first of all, it was a county highway, and the Westchester County owned it.
I thought it was
Yeah, it's you can see it if you look on the old subdivision maps. It was definitely a county highway, and so this piece of land sat there. No, it wasn't the Boston Westchester and Boston Railroad.
Went by the Girl Scout house. That was the railroad station.
That was the railroad station, but then we're talking about up further and a leather stocking trail, and that was, I think, in the days of Christine Hellwig as a supervisor, and we purchased it from the county. And it was one of the best things that the town ever did, because that land sat there and the county, of course, didn't want to keep it up, and it was just sort of a junky place. And so the town purchased it, and it is an absolutely wonderful asset. But it was a proposed highway, somewhat like the Hutch, curving around and so on. Pardon? Jimmy Johnson, yes, was another.
It was just, I think Nancy can tell you how it got the name. I mean, it was a piece of land and somebody thought Leather Stocking Trail. I mean, what's his name? He wasn't, I mean, James Fenimore Cooper's real leather stocking things was in Cooperstown. It wasn't here. He was all over the place. It sounded nice.
We got to stare at his mural in the.
Yes, but the one thing that I want Emmy Lou to say, because I think Emmy Lou, well, maybe it wasn't Emily who told me this. It might have been somebody else, but I was sitting down at the Larchmont Yacht Club 30 years ago, and one of Emmy Lou's contemporaries, or somebody older than Emmy Lou, told me, and I'm sure Emmy Lou will say this is true, maybe she won't, that before the crash, the daughters and sons of the people who lived in the cottages in Larchmont Manor, who were like the well-off social illiterati of Larchmont, when they got married, they moved up to Rookin Glen because it was like chicer and it was stockbroker houses. And some of the houses in the village of Larchmont down by the water were getting a little crusty because, you know, they were old and they hadn't had real heat and all that stuff. Is that true, Emmy Lou? She's going like this. Who was your friend that... Okay, but who was the...
Jane Trenholm.
Jane Trenholm told me that. She told me, R.I.P. Okay, she told me that the chicer people, if you look in the New York Times, not obituaries, social page, you would see that these people were taking the wedding trip to, you know, England, Malta, and someplace else, and returning to their new house in Rookin Glen. So then, at some point, the houses in Larchmont, during kind of bad times, were getting a little not so good looking. And then things that, you know, more money came and we weren't in a depressed state and people started moving in and fixing everything. But there was a time in my youth when there were people with 12 kids in some of those houses and they were peeling paint and like, didn't look too good. Now we're in a renaissance of those houses, I guess.
Yes, and some more questions, Frank.
I'd like to hear some more tales out of Lebanon.
Well, wait a minute. No, yeah, we're crossing lines here. We're crossing lines. So the third program is going to be the village of Larchmont. So,
Just repeat the question.
yeah, she asked a question about the Bevan, which I may invite Jim Whittemore back for that program. Jackie.
The Leather Stocking Trail on maps, Google Maps says it's the alternate route to the Hutch. Because I know that because when we walked, we were horrified that the Hutch was through.
She asked, that said that there was this was an alternate route, the Leather Stocking Trail was an alternate route to the Hutch. Yeah, it could have been, but it shows on the maps.
But my question is,
Yep.
that big castle on the Leather Stocking Trail and Weaver, is there a history to that?
Well, all I know is
Repeat the question.
when you're on Weaver Street and you're going toward Bonnie Briar from the Post Road on the right past Bonnie Briar Way, there's that, quote, castle. I can't remember exactly who built that thing, but I do remember coming down in a car with my French teacher, who was a very haughty Hungarian woman, who, you know, but she could speak French better than we could. Coming from school on a Friday from Sacred Heart, and she took a look. We were dropping her at the Larchmont station, and she went, "Oh mon Dieu, what a monstrosity," or something, pointing to the castle. She said it was an imitation of the such and such place in the Loire Valley, which it is apparently. The only thing I know about it is that one of my fellow alumni named Zora Gristidi lived in there. Now that's from the Gristidi supermarkets. They were German immigrants who came to the city of New York and sold ice. And they sold ice to keep vegetables and fruit, from rotting. And I think they also gave it to funeral parlors. But they started a grocery store. They got to be very wealthy, and she lived in there. That's all I know. It's gone from place to place, but it is a true imitation of some castle. Do you know who built it? What about you, Emmy Lou? Jane Trenham, if she were here, would know.
Either that or she'd make it up. I have another, all right, Jane, Janini.
I just have an anecdote. My father-in-law grew up on Hillcrest. They built the house from a Sears catalog, and the Weaver Street Firehouse was a staging to transport troops in World War II. So they all walked to the Weaver Street Firehouse, and then they were taken on buses to the Scarsdale train station, and then taken to the city or wherever they went to go to the war.
Great anecdote.
I remember doing it.
Thank you. So I'm only here at Lippin Time, 25 years, West Garden Road.
Oh, you beat him, he's 23.
All right. And my realtor told me to step up. She's sitting right here, Janet. Made my real offer. Anyway, that was nothing.
How much did you pay, Janet?
You're now under the table.
Oh, God.
So,
Non-taxable.
Became Edwards, became Scott. What was that parcel? What's the history of that little parcel? On the post
What
road,
parcel again?
The Stop and Shop.
Ferndale.
Yeah, it was open land. And,
The motel was there.
well, the Gap was Horry Chevrolet and was a sort of a army type building. And if you look at the building, you can still see the roof. It's like a Quonset hut. But Tom Horry, who was related to the Currys by marriage, ran a Chevrolet dealership there.
Finance came in when? 60s?
Finest came in because old man Pepe had an idea. He was a little contractor, and he started to find sites for Finest Supermarket, and that's how he became wealthy. But one of the things I recall and I had on my list, and Jack mentioned the Guadagnola family, and one of the huge controversies we had, which is now a very popular place for people who are downsizing. We don't have many places to downsize, although Elkin Park is a good one, is the Carlton House. And the Carlton House was a swampy piece of land owned by Mr. Guadagnola. And he proposed to develop that and have an apartment house built, and it was an enormous controversy. Except that it's extremely popular to buy an apartment there now. Anybody have any?
I was on the town zoning board at the time.
All right, we'll give this to Ann.
I was on the town zoning board at the time when that development came before us.
Packed courtroom.
Packed Weaver Street, upstairs in the Weaver Street old fireplace. And then about halfway through the presentation, we moved into the village of Larchmont, and since it has its own zoning board, I left the town zoning board. But thank you, town, for that was my the beginning of my civic responsibility. But it has been a rousing success, although it had been downsized a bit from the original proposal, which is the way everything seems to happen.
And there were old houses there on that road, 3-story, on that, it was called Jefferson Street, but there were old houses, 2 or 3 of them. It was very falling apart kind of houses, and there were multi-family frame houses there, and they knocked them down, which in a way knocked out people who didn't have much money from the town.
All right, Jack.
Jim, you and I might have met years ago in Pleasure Bay, which was the name of the bar in the Bevan Hotel. I remember one of my first dates with Diane was down to Pleasure Bay, and it was a little bar down in the basement. I also remember that when my sister got married, some of the wedding party stayed there. And I remember being up in one of the rooms of that hotel at the time. I can't think of the man that owned it now, but he was a big chubby fella and a really pleasant character. And he loved to sit down there and chat with you in Pleasure Bay and tell you the history of the place. So, nice to know you as a bartender.
I just have a few reminiscences. My family moved here in 1962, and I remember when the tide was high on the brook, little boys would have their boats on the brook, and it was such a beautiful.
Talking about the overflow of
But
the
also,
brook.
one thing I was very proud of as a resident of the town is the way they handled the US Open at winter. Maybe Valerie would like to weigh in on some of
The US Open.
of that.
Yeah, how the town dealt with it.
The town knew that they were coming, and they were very, the Wingfoot, it wasn't Wingfoot, it was that US Golf Association were very pretentious. And I remember they wanted me to write a letter, a draft letter, saying there are 3 golf courses in the town of Mamaroneck. The preeminent Wingfoot, and then Bonnie Briar, and that was all. Bonnie Briar and Hampshire, so I changed the letter to alphabetical. They were very presumptuous, that's all I could say. They were horrible in a way, and they made a deal with Governor Pataki that all the policing was going to be done by state cops. So that meant that none of our cops would get any overtime or anything. So we pushed back on that one. But it was like a landing at Normandy. It took a year and a half to figure out how you could close the streets, where the people could park. The people coming in limos with their no socks and their cigars wanted to only have to walk 3 feet. So we handled with them, and what happened was we got them to pay for putting blacktop on the whole of Old Carriage House Lane. We got them to repave the whole street. So and we had riots. We go to Wingfoot, and the people in that neighborhood screaming, "We don't want them crossing our backyard. We don't want this." So I said, "Well, what if you get a whole new street to take the potholes out?" And everything worked out all right. But we did get our own policemen in there. They talked down to us like we were rubes. But that's what happened with IKEA. They thought we were rubes too.
One of the little,
I just want to tell you that I'm a big golf fan. I'm a big golfing fan, especially Tiger Woods back then. And when we had the US Open at Wingfoot just a few years ago, we were not allowed to walk there, we were not allowed to drive there. So we would take our car to the station, park, and get on the buses. And people came from all over the country. And every one of them would say to us, "How do you pronounce the name of your town? Is it Mamaroneck?" Figure out how to pronounce our village of Mamaroneck, trying to take credit for everything. Because it says Mamaroneck, New York. That's right.
A couple of interesting things about real estate. Mandy Mandeville, who was a supervisor, was I thought of him as a tyrant as a kid. He was a really strong-willed guy, and he ruled Chatsworth Gardens. And so, if you wanted to have an apartment there when you downsized, you listed your house with Mandy, because Mandy got you an apartment. If you didn't list with Mandy, you were way down the list of getting an apartment there. And some of the other folks with Elkin Park. Which was and they should have built 5 of them in our community. And they were afraid, the only way it was approved was because the vets came in. And they were afraid they were going to hang their washout and it was going to look like a slum. And of course it's picture perfect in there. If you go, everybody's got their little yard and it's absolutely perfect. But there was Ben Brush, who was one of the original people, Johnny Merritt, who built Rye Ridge Shopping Center and went on to big things in Connecticut. And his sister was Mabel Mitchell, who ran Merritt Real Estate in Larchmont. And that's where Jane Trenholm worked for a while. So some of the names were all local GIs, and convinced them. And Mr. Elkin was out of the goodness of his heart. He said, "You guys are vets. Here's the property. I'm going to tear up the contract. Here's your down payment back." And they got 100% GI mortgages, and they each bought a house for $12,000. Valerie, thank you. All right. One more question, and appropriately is Jack's wife.
I just wanted to say, when we moved into Elkin Road in, I guess it was 59, we paid $19,500, and it was the highest that Elkin Road had ever gotten.
I bought a house there too, and I'd have to pay more for a car today than I did for that house. Any other questions? We're going to wrap it up. One more. You got a remnant. Oh, wait a minute. I'm sorry. You already. Keith.
Well, it's not really a question, but it's just a comment regarding the celebrities and different things. But those of you who know the curse of Babe Ruth, what is the curse of Babe Ruth? Boston Red Sox and the drought from 1918 to present up until 2000. Well, the curse of Babe Ruth is a result of the town of Mamaroneck. Mamaroneck High School at one time had a prodigy. His name was Dick McCabe. Dick McCabe was an excellent pitcher, and those of you who know 1911, 1912, Mamaroneck High School did not lose a baseball game. And as a result of this prodigy, he got drafted by the Boston Red Sox. He went to Pawtucket, played one season, went up to the Red Sox. He played on the 1918 Red Sox team with Babe Ruth. And at that particular time, Boston thought that Babe Ruth was expendable because they had a young prodigy who was a pitcher. His name was Dick McCabe. He graduated from Mamaroneck High School. And that particular team, he had a teammate named Harry Kane, to which there was a connection to Lou Gehrig and to Vince Lombardi.
I can't repeat that. All right, one more, Jack.
Famous first baseman for the Yankees. Lou Gehrig lived in Stonecrest for a while.
Yeah.
And why? Because of Harry Kane, Mamaroneck High School, 1912, who coached Commerce High School in New York City, to where Lou Gehrig graduated from. And he was the only person that Lou Gehrig's mother ever trusted.
All right, I want to thank everybody. There's a school board vote today for the school, I want to thank everybody for La Grande Tidbit. And I want you all to look forward maybe next fall for one for the village of Larchmont. And tell your friends, because this is a way, I believe, of continuing our oral history so that some of the folks who have moved in subsequent to us learn about how the continuity of our communities and how they came about. Thanks very much.